we will have a few minutes of questions at the end of the panel, just before we go to lunch. So what I'll do is introduce our next speaker, Stephanie Meek. She's just recently completed a Master's in English at the Open University and is about to commence PhD studies at the University of Exeter this September. Her preliminary research involves the field of literary censorship and the Victorian novel, with a particular interest in Hardy's constant battles with Mrs. Grundy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to come along and speak today. It's certainly going to be a tough act to follow after that excellent presentation that we've just heard. So, as we can see here, my paper is entitled Omit for Mag, the Woodlanders and the Art of Avoidance. And I've very deliberately got some nice, thick, bold red letters there to highlight that this presentation might be about the subject of censorship. And I think we all have, and immediately thinking about censorship, you do have this idea of sort of constraint, and it's quite a pejorative term. But what I'm hoping to show through my paper is that actually censorship can be something that's incredibly creative and really impacted on Hardy's aesthetics. On first meeting Hardy's woodland community, one might be struck by the comforting nostalgia of archaic pastoral tradition. We will probably feel sickened and intrigued. The lights have gone off there. I don't know if that's a good sign or not. Probably feel sickened and intrigued in equal measure by the beguiling treachery of Dr. Fitzpiers, or Dread, as I think I'm now going to always have in my mind. In all likeliness, we will be moved by that final desolate image of the ever-loyal Marty by the side of Giles's grave. It is fair to assume that within the context of this study day, in this very historical setting, that we share an appreciation of Hardy's great masterpiece, The Woodlanders. And whilst I do not want to suggest, and certainly I wouldn't dare to suggest it in the present company with us today, that Hardy's artistry is anything other than his own, what I will argue is that the aesthetic he had developed by the time that the novel was published in 1887 was in part the product of an insidious method of literary constraint, what I term as informal literary censorship. It is my contention that Hardy can be seen as a more socially radical writer, not despite this form of censorship, but because of it. Informal censorship differs from the more sensational, headline-grabbing censorship that we might all be familiar with. So if we looked for evidence of the way that legislative censorship impacted on Victorian writers, we probably wouldn't find very many cases. One such notable case would be of the publisher Henry Visitelli, who in 1889, at the age of 69, was imprisoned for 3 months for his translations and publication of Émile Zola's novels. Whilst clearly cases such as this sent shockwaves around the literary community, what interests me particularly is the more nuanced, unofficial type of censorship, which I believe had a profound influence on shaping Hardy's work. This form of censorship functioned via a system of distribution informed by notions that certain sectors of society, namely young people, and particularly women, of course, and people of, inverted commas, lower class, should not come into contact with material that could corrupt them. In this, it's important to note that the intentions of the writer were actually irrelevant. What mattered was the assumed effect that the text would have on the audience. So obviously, a young girl is a lot more vulnerable to being corrupted than a middle-class gentleman, older gentleman. So this was why that the system of distribution sought to protect people who were thought of as being the more vulnerable in society. Most prominent of these was... let's go back a little bit. The Circulating Libraries tapped into this moral anxiety by creating a paternalistic system of book distribution. And most prominent of these was Charles Moody's Select Library. So if we just move on. Established in Bloomsbury in 1842, Moody's became synonymous with affordable, wholesome family entertainment, its distinctive yellow-jacketed books denoting a virtuous seal of approval. Moody even inspired his own rhyming couplets. As children must have Punch and Judy, so I can't do without my Moody. So it's got a definite ring to it there. I think we'll all remember that one. The Circulating Libraries' monopoly of the fiction market by necessity shaped the way that writers approach their subjects. And here we've got, this is an illustration from Punch magazine. And here it refers to the way that the libraries approached the promotion of the novel in 3 volumes, or the triple-decker, as it came to be known. It's referred to here in this picture from the magazine in 1877. Distributing the novel in 3 volumes as opposed to 1 meant that Moody could offer greater value to his customers by charging them a guinea a year subscription fee, which was a lot less than if they had to buy all 3 instalments themselves. Thus, the triple-decker became the mobilising force behind Moody's monopoly of the fiction market. And this was a monopoly that Hardy was very well aware of, as he noted in a letter to J.T. Grain in 1889 regarding the possible dramatisation of the Woodlanders. And he says, "You have probably observed that the ending of the story, hinted rather than stated, is that the heroine is doomed to an unhappy life with an inconstant husband. I could not accentuate this strongly in the book by reason of the conventions of the libraries, etc. Thus, it is my contention that the anxiety that these libraries engendered on authors and publishers and other people involved in the book industry came to exert a constraint on literary output which by its very nature amounted to an informal but nonetheless profound type of literary censorship. Hardy's own self-censorship in writing The Woodlanders is testimony to constraints imposed by these conditions. Whether self-censorship has occurred as opposed to general editing in order to obtain artistic perfection, as we all know that Hardy was very apt to do, depends on specific criteria, according to Donald Pisa. Firstly, he says, there needs to be external evidence that the text has been self-censored, such as letters, diaries, and memoirs. Secondly, the writer's motivations for that self-censorship need to be established. So if we take then the example of Hardy's characterisation of the dreaded Fitzpiers, the portrayal of Hardy's debauched doctor drew the largest amount of criticism from contemporary reviewers. A reviewer in the Spectator magazine in 1897 complained that Hardy renders it impossible for us to suppose that he entertains indignation and disgust towards Fitzpiers. Likewise, William Wallace, writing in the Academy, also in 1897, stated that in recent fiction, even in recent French fiction, there has figured no more exasperating scoundrel than Edred Fitzpiers, who yet, in the 3rd volume of The Woodlanders, figures as the repentant, or at all events, the returned prodigal. These reviews certainly provide the motivation for Hardy's later revisions of Fitzpiers' character, in order to satisfy the demand that his behaviour be more vociferously condemned by the authorial voice. The 1895 Osgood McIlvaine edition saw the most substantial of Hardy's revisions. Here, the concerns of the critics are responded to as Melbury soliloquises on the fate of his daughter.
Really sorry to interrupt today. Couldn't see the caption.
Oh, sorry. Would you like me to just... If I just go back there. Yeah, it's a little bit unclear, actually, so if I just read it out. Keeper of the Circulating Library says, "I'm very sorry, ma'am. The 3rd volume happens still to be out, but here is the entire novel in 1 volume." And then the young lady says, "Oh, that won't do. How on earth am I to find my place in it?" So it's the fact that the audience of these novels was very, very used to having the novel in 3 volumes. And of course, this was a distribution system that the circulating libraries really relied on because they made huge financial gain from it. So if I just go back to the next one. Okay, right. So this is an extract then which was revised for the later Osgood McIlvaine edition of the novel. You'll have to excuse me if I attempt a Dorset accent here. I hope I don't offend anybody. Well, he's her husband, Melbury said to himself, and let her take him back to her bed if she will. But let her bear in mind that the woman who walks and laughs somewhere at the very moment, whose neck he'll be... and that the woman who walks... start that again. That the woman walks and laughs somewhere at the very moment, whose neck he'll be coaling next year as he does hers tonight, and as he did Felice Charmon's last year and Suki Damson's the year afore. It is a forlorn hope for her, and God knows how it will end. So here, as well as rendering a much less sympathetic portrayal of Fitzpiers, Hardy also asserts the sexuality of Grace, whose prime motivation, according to her father, in her reuniting with her husband, appears to be in taking him back to her bed. This emphasis is particularly significant within the context of Hardy's 1890 Candour in English Fiction, which was written as a contribution to a symposium in the New Review. Here he argues for a more honest portrayal of the physiological facts of life, criticising both the role of the family magazines and the role of the circulating libraries. As a consequence, the magazine in particular, and the circulating library in general, do not foster the growth of the novel which reflects and reveals life. They directly tend to exterminate it by monopolising all literary space. Cause and effect were never more clearly conjoined, though commentators upon the result, both French and English, seem seldom, if ever, to trace their connection. That the magazine and library have arrogated to themselves the dispensation of fiction is not the fault of the authors, but of circumstances over which they, as representatives of Grub Street, have no control. Hardy's revisions, then, within the context of this essay and reviews of Hardy's treatment of Fitzpiers, certainly seem to provide motivation for self-censorship to have occurred. However, disentangling revisions made due to self-censorship from revisions for entirely different reasons, such as Hardy wanting to portray a bolder view of female sexuality, for example, is a far more problematic business. If we look again at the 1895 revised passage, so if we go back to that slide. On the one hand here, Hardy has heightened his portrayal of Grace's sexuality, whereas on the other, he has given way to the moral outrage concerning Fitzpiers' supposed redemption by strengthening his condemnation of Fitzpiers. This reflects Hardy's ambivalence toward the issue of censorship, and more widely raises issues about the extent to which we can categorically establish whether self-censorship is entirely externally enforced or whether it is inclusive within and necessary to the creative process. Despite Hardy's seeming distaste for the censorious forces at work within the library and magazine industries, as he outlines in his Candour in English Fiction, he did seem to almost rather enjoy playing the censorship game. For example, by the time Tess of the D'Urbervilles was published in 1891, he was well established enough to have foregone the serial editions of his work, and it was the family magazines that actually did demand more severe bowdlerizations than the novel formats. So with Tess, he didn't actually need to kind of succumb to those bowdlerizations because he was really well established enough just to have gone straight with the novel. And he was so determined for serial publication that he severely bowdlerised Tess in order to appease the demands of the graphic magazine, thus benefiting financially from both the serial and novel markets. Furthermore, despite arguing for a more visceral realism within the magazine industry, which he does in Candour in English Fiction, he is surprisingly muted on an alternative approach. Far from advocating greater access to the realist novel, which he seems to be suggesting that we should make these novels more true to reality and give a greater access. For example, in Tess, one of the reasons that seems to be implied that Tess does get herself into trouble is that she was never given the opportunity to read about, as she says, the way that men behaved. So far from advocating this, he actually does suggest greater segregation within the magazine industry. For example, magazines specifically for adult consumption, and also, as he puts it, as an offshoot, there might be at least one magazine for the middle-aged and old. So that might be quite an interesting read there. So far then, I've established that Hardy's revisions in the light of moral criticism and within the context of his own anti-censorship writing can be seen as evidence that he did consciously engage with informal censorship debates and practices. What I will now argue is that far from these practices having a reductive effect on Hardy's work, informal censorship was paradoxically productive in constructing Hardy as a writer of social radicalism. In her book British Modernism and Censorship, Celia Marshick reappraises traditional tropes associated with modernism, such as fragmentation and indirection, as being in part brought about by the climate of literary censorship within which those writers worked. Tropes which I would argue are also present in Hardy's work. For example, let us take a look at Fitzpiers' moonlit encounter with Suki. Fitzpiers saw in a moment that having taken to open ground, she had placed herself at his mercy, and he promptly vaulted over after her. She flitted a little way down the mead when all at once her elusive form disappeared, as if it had sunk into the earth. She had buried herself in one of the haycocks. Fitzpiers, now thoroughly excited, was not going to let her escape him thus. He approached and set about turning over the heaps one by one. As soon as he paused, tantalised and puzzled, he was directed anew by an imitative kiss which came from her hiding place under the hay. In this rather steamy extract, we see Hardy cleverly elude the censor through his use of euphemism and metaphor. The heady nature of Fitzpiers' sexual pursuit of Suki is barely masked by the animalistic metaphor of a fox and hound chase. Fitzpiers' excitement, as Hardy euphemistically calls it, is chillingly close to savagery as he turns over the haystacks to reveal his prey. However, what is particularly interesting in this conventional opposition between the male aggressor and the female victim is Suki's portrayal as willing accomplice in this sexual game of cat and mouse, albeit under the false impression that she was actually being pursued by her lover Timothy Tangs. By seeking to elude Fitzpiers, she participates in classic Freudian titillation. In the same way, Hardy titillates the reader through his textual ellipsis, encouraging us to participate in what essentially is a cross-class encounter. Furthermore, by aligning Fitzpiers with motifs of animalistic desire and predatory cunning, motifs whose use, I'm arguing, are brought about by censorship, Hardy undermines conventional perceptions of those with high societal status being of superior moral nature. Dr. Fitzpiers, as dignified pillar of the community, is reduced to the status of a primitive creature hunting down its quarry. In this, Hardy goes further than he does in his portrayal of Alec in Tess of the d'Urbervilles. Alec d'Urberville is marked out from the start as a charlatan, with no actual claim to the ancient heritage which Tess assumes him to possess. Whereas Dale Kramer asserts, in Hardy's revisions for the 3-volume novel, Fitzpiers' ancient lineage is stressed, sharpening his function as a despoiler of rustic values. As Mrs. Oliver says, though he belongs to the oldest, ancientest family in the country, he stooped to make himself useful like any common man. Thus, Hardy's subversion of Fitzpiers' status as virtuous Victorian gentleman, in capital letters, ultimately reveals the hypocrisy of the class-driven puritanical assumptions inherent within debates around obscenity and censorship. In doing so, I would argue, Hardy foreshadows the modernist movement with its use of, as Marshick purports, placing purity sentiments in the mouths of unlikable or patently misguided characters in order to mock the purity movement. So I think Hardy was quite ahead of his time in using, because obviously he couldn't come out and directly undermine the middle classes. When he did try to do that in his first novel, the novel wasn't allowed to be published. So by doing it in this more underhand, more subtle way, he actually, I would argue, has a more radical effect of really undermining these emblems of middle class, upper class society. Ironically, it is Hardy's less superficially contentious material in The Woodlanders that has its most powerful resonance in subverting conventional mores. When Hardy wrote in the manuscript, Omit for Mag, referring to Macmillan's magazine, next to the words, "It was daybreak before Fitzpiers and Suki Damson re-entered Little Hintock," he anticipated the outrage that the sexual liaison between Suki and Edred would have on a censorious public. Indeed, despite his omission, the magazine's editor, Mowbray Morris, still cautioned Hardy against portraying Suki in too shameful a way. However, Hardy's more subtle portrayal of the affair between Fitzpiers and Felice Charmond can be seen to present the most devastating attack on Victorian morality. Indeed, it's interesting that revisions to Fitzpiers' character, in order, as we've seen, to construct him in a more negative light, actually had the converse effect to Hardy's revisions of Mrs. Charmond. She becomes, as Kramer asserts, a richer and more complex character, whereas Fitzpiers' personality is essentially diminished and mocked. Therefore, I would argue that the tenets of informal censorship created the conditions within which Hardy was able to tacitly undermine notions of the submissive female falling prey to the predatory male, and instead presents the converse, a diminished and derisory representative of masculine gentility falling victim to a sophisticated social superior. This shift in gender roles is highlighted through the way that the couple begin their affair, with a recumbent Felice Charmond very much in control of her attentive doctor. Mrs. Charmond did not move more than to raise her eyes to him, and he came and stood by her. She glanced up at his face across her brows and forehead, and then he observed a blush creep over her decidedly handsome cheeks. Her eyes, which had lingered upon him with an inquiring, conscious expression, were hastily withdrawn, and she mechanically applied the cigarette again to her lips. For a moment he forgot his errand, till suddenly arousing himself, he addressed her, formally condoled with her, and made the usual professional inquiries about what had happened to her and where she was hurt. "That's what I want you to tell me," she murmured in tones of indefinable reserve. This scene presents a stark contrast to Fitzpiers' earlier, more contentious sexual conquest of Suki. Here, Hardy shifts the emphasis to the manipulative Mrs. Charmond, with her euphemistic blushes and pretense for the need of immediate medical assistance. Felice is at once both opaque and inviting, causing a wrong-footed Fitzpiers to seek refuge in his professional persona. Felice's obvious worldliness, as she applies the cigarette to her lips, is juxtaposed with the flustered doctor who has momentarily forgotten his errand in his contemplation of her decidedly handsome cheeks. I would argue that by inverting the binary opposition of the seduced and the seducer, Hardy cleverly transcends concerns over issues of propriety. Because Hardy admits to show Fitzpiers as explicit male aggressor, and because the complexity of Felice Charmond's persona as would-be seducer is only implied rather than stated, Hardy blurs the boundaries between conventional notions of male and female stereotypes. The dichotomy here between subject and object is problematised. Felice blushes under Fitzpiers' gaze, but he is equally perturbed by her lingering eyes. In concluding, I would argue that it is at the sight of the fissures that were made possible by informal literary censorship that Hardy produced his most socially progressive work. Writing under the influence of constraint shaped Hardy's artistry, causing him to develop and refine techniques that cleverly allowed him to negotiate the finest of lines between exposing hypocrisy within Victorian society and appeasing the so-called virtuous librarian Charles Moody. From its manuscript through to serialisation in Macmillan's magazine and on to its later Osgood McIlvaine editions and the Wessex edition, which came even later as well, the text of the Woodlanders is a palimpsest through which we can glimpse a conflict that was played out at the very heart of the Victorian fiction industry, a conflict which ultimately honed Hardy's craftsmanship. By developing the art of avoidance through omission, misdirection and euphemism, Hardy could confront the very conventions which sought to constrain him. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steph. I really enjoyed that.